Hi guys, welcome back to Math with OG. This happens to be our last video for now under binary operation and is simply the inverse of an element under a particular operation. If this is your first time here, kindly use the subscribe button, or if you've been here before and you've not used the subscribe button, kindly subscribe and turn on post notification so that you get alerted the moment a new video drops. Now, the inverse of element x denoted by V under a binary operation can be determined using identity element. So you should note that for every given time, an element will operate with its inverse to give identity element. Remember in our previous video, we said an element will operate with identity element to give you that same element. However, an element will operate on its inverse to give you identity element. And same rule holds for 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 an operation to have an identity element, it must be commutative. Now, for an element to have an inverse, that operation must have an identity element. So you need identity element to get inverse of an element. An operation without identity element cannot be giving you inverse of other elements. Now, if that's the case, remember we have identity element for addition and for multiplication. We also have a formula for finding the inverse of any element in addition and the inverse of any element in multiplication. Now, in our last video, we agreed that the identity element for addition is equal to 0. So if that's the case, any element in addition, any element in addition, we add up to its inverse to give us 0. Any element, say x, we add up to its inverse to give us 0. As an element operating on its inverse must give you the identity element. So the inverse of x must be equal to minus x. The inverse of x must be equal to minus x. So we also call this guy additive inverse. Additive inverse. So if you are asked what is the additive inverse of 5? The additive inverse of 5 is equal to minus 5. Because when you add up 5 to minus 5, it will give you the identity element of 0. What is the additive inverse of 2 over 3? The additive inverse of 2 over 3 is minus 2 over 3. So when you add up 2 over 3 to minus 2 over 3, it will give you 0. What is the additive inverse of minus 7? The additive inverse of minus 7 is equal to 7. But if you add up minus 7 to 7, it will give you 0. Now, next thing we should be looking at is multiplication. That's the inverse under multiplication. Identity element for multiplication, we agreed it is equal to 1. Identity element for multiplication is equal to 1. So an element we multiply its inverse to give us identity element, which is 1. An element we multiply its inverse to give us identity element, which is 1. So the inverse of x will be equal to 1 all over x. The inverse of x will be equal to 1 all over x. So what is the multiplicative inverse? Okay, for this one, we call it the multiplicative inverse, or we call it the reciprocal. Multiplicative inverse or the reciprocal. So what is the multiplicative inverse of 5? Multiplicative inverse of 5 is equal to 1 over 5. What is the multiplicative inverse of 2 over 3? Multiplicative inverse of 2 over 3 is equal to 3 over 2. This times this is 1. This times this is also 1. What is the multiplicative inverse? The multiplicative inverse of minus 5 over 7. The multiplicative inverse of minus 5 over 7 is equals to minus 7 over 5. Multiplicative inverse of minus 5 over 7 is equal to minus 7 over 5, because minus 5 over 7 times minus 7 over 5 should give you 1. So that's that for additive inverse and multiplicative inverse. So what rule will you follow for any operation? An element will operate on its inverse to give you the identity element. Now let's go back to this question. We are told to find the inverse of 7 under this operation. If you remember our last video, after solving this, we agreed that the identity element here is equal to 3. The identity element is equal to 3. So if the identity element is 3, it means that for any time I have P will operate on its inverse to give me theory. P will operate on its inverse to give me theory because theory is the identity element. So what is P operating on its inverse? P operating on its inverse must follow this rule of operation, which is P multiplied by its inverse all over theory. In this case, P multiplied by Q all over theory. So if that's the case, I will have P multiplied by its inverse all over theory is equal to theory. It must follow the rule PV over theory must be equal to theory, where theory is the identity element. PV over theory is me following the rule. Now I want to make V the subject of the formula because I'm looking for the inverse of P. V, making V the subject of the formula, V will be equal to theory multiplied by theory. That will give us 9 all over P. V will be equal to 9 over P. So for every given term, the inverse of P is equal to 9 over P. The inverse of P is equal to 9 over P. So what will be the inverse of 7? The inverse, this is the inverse of P. The inverse of 7 will be equal to 9 all over 7. As simple as that. Inverse of 7 will be equal to 9 over 7. What will be the inverse of 30? Inverse of 30 will be 9 all over 30. Now let's check if our answer is correct. We just said the inverse of P must operate on P to give me identity. So I'm working with the inverse of 7 and 7. So the inverse of 7 is 9 over 7 must operate on 7 to give me identity. And what is the identity element? Identity element is 3. Now let's find 9 over 7 operating on 7. Remember the rule of the operation. PQ all over 3. PQ all over 3. So P is 9 over 7. Q is 7. Everything all over 3. 7 cancel 7. 3 here 1. 3 into 9 3. So this will give me 3. So it is obvious that the inverse of 7 is 9 over 7. So that's how you find the inverse of an element under a particular operation. So let's do a recap of identity element and inverse. For an operation to have an identity element, it must be commutative, and if it's commutative to have an identity element, and from there each element in that operation can have an inverse. Each element can have an inverse. Now for identity elements, an element X will operate on identity element to give you that same element X. However, an element X will operate on its inverse to give you identity element. This guy will follow the rule of the operation. This guy will also follow the rule of the operation. Now, the identity element for addition is 0. That for multiplication is 1. The inverse of any element in addition is negative the number, while the inverse of any element in multiplication is 1 over the number. So the inverse in addition, we'll call it the additive inverse. The inverse in multiplication, we'll call it the multiplicative inverse, or we'll call it the reciprocal. Thanks for watching this video. That is all under binary operation. In our next video, we'll be starting a new topic entirely. So if you found this video to be helpful, can use the like button, subscribe button, and the share button. Thanks for watching once more. See you guys in my next video.